Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning into my channel. Hope you're all doing well. And today we are going to look at connecting a front end and back end via a single page application and an API. So in front of us, we have the API that we've been working on earlier. And what we're going to do is we're going to fire it up. So we'll do node index.js in that folder just to get the API running. And then we'll go over to our browser and we'll hit one of the endpoints here. So the listing endpoint will give us a list of data, hopefully. So let's go to localhost, was it 3000? Let's check. And we define the port here. Yeah, so localhost 3000. And if we go to listings, then we should see something like this. Yours might look a little bit different because I have a JSON prettifier running in the browser, an extension that you can go and just install into Chrome or Brave or whatever you fancy. So now that we have that, what we'll do is we'll kind of try to get this into an application and render it to the screen. So let's go ahead and go to our terminal and we'll create a new project. So I'm gonna say make their frontend, which will make a folder called frontend, and then we'll go into that and we'll create a couple of files. So first we'll have index.html, and then we'll have an index.js file, and we'll create a app CSS file as well. So let's open that up, and in our editor now we'll have an empty index.html file, an empty JS file, and an empty CSS file. So we'll fill this out a little bit and just using Emmet here to quickly prototype up a HTML shell. So that'll give us the basic structure for an HTML document. And in here, we'll go ahead and we'll say script source index.js. And we'll create an element here called, we'll give that an ID of root. And then we'll link up the CSS file as well. So link rel style sheet. href is app CSS and type text CSS. I think, if I remember correctly, that should be enough. So in here we're gonna go Python HTTP server, and now we have an HTTP server just serving our index.html page on port 3000. And I think actually stop that. Do Python simple. Let me check. Simple HTTP. Nope. All right, so we'll just use the standard server. So let's go ahead and go to 8000. And looks like we have our HTML page here, which is empty. That's what we expect. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our editor and we'll start, we'll go to the CSS. I'll just give it some basic styling. So we'll say that the body is going to have a height, min height of 100 VH. It's going to have a background color of just a basic gray. We're going to give it some padding. No, actually, no padding on the body. We're gonna go ahead and just leave it there. So now we just have a blank gray canvas, and inside our index.js file, we'll just console log to make sure we wired everything up correctly. And refreshing that and opening the console, then we can see our log right here. All right, so now we have wired everything up. And what we're going to do is we're going to build out a really small app. So let's go ahead and go back to our editor. And inside of index.js, we're going to say const root element equals document get element by ID. And we'll give it the root property. And that's going to link up with the ID that we put on this div element here in our index.html file. So in our index.js file, we actually have access to that element. So this is our root element. It's where we are going to mount our application. And that's a common strategy for all single page applications. So let's go ahead and create a basic header. So we'll say const create header or render header. And we'll say header equals document create element div. And then we'll say header class list add, and we'll give it the class name of header. And then we'll say root element append child header. And let's call the function. And let's see what else. Maybe we should have some kind of text that explains the application in the header. So we'll go ahead and we'll do header text is equal to document create element h1, and we'll say header text dot class list add, and we'll give it the class of header text, and we'll say header text content equals listings. And then we'll go ahead and say header append child, because this will be a child of the header, and we'll give that the header text node. All right, so if we go back to our browser now and refresh, we have a header at the top with the class of header and the h1 with the class of header text. So let's go ahead and just style that really quick. We'll go to our CSS and we'll say header. Background color is going to be white. We're going to have and actually we also need a container in here. Let's just give that a padding for now. So we'll give it a padding of 10 pixels and make sure we set the margin and padding to 0 on the body. So we'll refresh that. Okay, so I want a little more padding on the left and right. Let's give this family Arial Helvetica. All right, something like that. And then we'll say font size 16 pixels, and we'll change the padding a little bit on top and bottom. Okay, so let's say 0.8 rems. We'll refresh that. And yeah, that works for now. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this data and we are going to render some items to the screen. So let's go ahead and implement that next. So we have our endpoint here, which is localhost 3000/listings. So we're going to go ahead and go into our index.js file, and we're going to say get listing. And that's going to be a function. And we're going to say fetch localhost 3000 listings. And once we have that response, then we'll go ahead and we'll say response JSON. And then we'll console log the data. So on the response, we just call the JSON method in order to get the body in JSON format. And then we'll get the data passed onto us in the next .then clause here. And we're going to log that out. So if you're not familiar with fetch, don't stress this too much. We can go deeper into that later. But this is just going to give us the data from the API. And if we go back to our browser and we now check the console here, and we hit refresh, and we need to call the function. Nothing happens unless you call functions generally. So let's call the function here, and then we'll refresh. Aha. And now we're at an interesting point. So you see this error here. So access to fetch as localhost 3000/listings has been blocked by course policy. No access control allow origin header. And that's because there's a security mechanism in the browser that disallows data transfer between a client and a server when those are on different domains. So here we are on localhost, but we're exposing different ports. So the browser still thinks they are different domains. So our frontend is trying to access the backend from port 8000, and our backend is on port 3000. So when we are doing this data fetching from the front end to the backend directly with the client, then the browser says, well, you're not allowed to do that because the server hasn't whitelisted you and said that it's okay for you to get this data. So when you get this error and you get it in the front end mostly, because the backend doesn't really care about it, but the backend has to define it. So it has to be done on the backend. So let's go ahead and go back to our terminal, or let's actually open up our API. And then on our listings endpoint, we have to add a header. So let's go ahead and say res.setHeader, and we'll say access control allow origin. And we'll give that the value of HTTP localhost 8000. And then we'll restart our app. And let's go ahead and see in the browser, if we refresh, if that helps. All right. And now you can see that we were able to get the data, because in the API, we set the access control allow origin header, which says that this client is allowed to get this data. So now we have the data from the API and we're actually logging it to the console. So what we're going to do with that now is we're actually going to create some items here, and we'll place them on the screen. So let's head back to our editor, and we'll go ahead and we'll say in here, after we fetched the data, then we want to create listings. So let's go ahead and just create a function here, function body, sorry. And then inside of the function body, we are going to create the listings. And we will have a listings container as well. And then once we have the listings, we'll append that to the listings container. And then we'll add the listings container to the root element. So we'll say root element append child listings container. All right, so you can see that I'm actually writing out things that I haven't created yet. And that's something I do frequently just to kind of figure out how I want the API or how I want the code to look. And then once I'm happy with how it looks and how it reads, I'm going to go ahead and implement the functionality. So let's go ahead and start implementing some of this. So we'll create the create listings container function, and that's going to create a element, and that's going to be a div, and we'll say container class list add listings container, and then we'll just return that out. So now we'll have the container. The next thing will be to create the listings. And we'll create that function. And we'll go ahead and create a div first. So listings equals, actually we'll say create listing. And then let's see here, inside of here, what we want to do is we want to take the data. Let's just check in the console. That's an array, so we're going to say listings equals data map. And then for each listing, we will create the, we'll call the create listing function. All right. So now inside of create listing, we'll create a document create element. So we'll start with the div. And then let's actually have a look at the data here. So inside each of these, we have a header and a description and a link. So ideally, and an image URL. So ideally, we want card or something that we can click to kind of go to the link and have some text to display the header and the description. So we're gonna go ahead and implement that. So we have the listings container here, and then we'll actually make that a link. And then we'll have a image. So it's going to be document create element image, and we're going to say image source equals, and we need to accept the listing here. So we're passing in the listing data here in the map, and that means that inside of this function we have access to the data that we see in our console here. So the description, the header, and the image URL. So what we can say is that we created an image tag here, or node. And we want the image source to be equal to the listing image. And we need to say image URL. All right. And then we can say listings append child image. And we're going to say const header equals document create element h2. And we're going to say header class list add, and we'll say listing header. And then we'll do a paragraph document create element p, and we'll say header class list add listing paragraph. Okay, and now we want to add the data. So we want to say header text content equals listing header. And then we'll say, and we need this to be paragraph. Let's say paragraph text content equals listing description. We're just mapping it up to the data object that we logged out to the console. Next, let's create an inner container. And that's going to be a div. And we'll give that inner container a class name of listing inner container. And then we'll go ahead and wire all of this up. And what we want is to have the inner container hold the header and the paragraph. And then we'll have that beneath the image. So we'll go ahead and say inner container append child header, and then inner container append child paragraph. And then we'll say inner container, listings append child inner container. And then we'll return the listing. And this is singular, so I think I want to rename the listings to listing, and then we'll call this data object listing data. Now we need to change the references here. Okay, so now we have the listing function. Let's go ahead and say data.map, and for each listing we can just do for each here. And then we'll say for each listing we're creating it, so we need to store that in a variable. So we'll say listing markup listing node, and then the listing container is going to get the listing node appended to it. And if we now hit save and refresh, hopefully we'll have the listings. All right, so let's go ahead and style it a little bit. So we'll say we'll take the listing container, and we'll say display flex, max width 1024 pixels, and we'll give the margin 0 auto and a padding of 20. Let's see. Let's check it out. So did we wire it up correctly? So we have the listings container here. And we need to make the right last name, obviously. And if we now find our okay. So for some reason that's not being applied. We have the listings container and all right, so a hard refresh often helps to solve all your problems. Now let's go ahead and keep styling a little bit. And we'll grab the, let's say, listing, class list, add. That's going to be a singular listing. And we'll just say 250 pixels. Justify content here. Space part or between. Not 25, 250. And background color is going to be white. And the listing header and listing inner container. We'll style those next. Listing inner container. Give that a padding of 8 pixels. Give the listing header a font size of 1 rem. And refresh. Great. Now let's go ahead and get some images. Let's see. Let's go ahead and see if we can just grab one of these. Oh, of course. Yeah, we'll try that. And we need to actually go to our API and go to the data and try to just swap this out. Let's see if that's going to help us a little bit to get images. Perfect. Now we have the images, and then we need to go ahead and style them. So say listing image max width 100%. And hit refresh. All right. So let's do space around instead. All right, I don't think we need to do a lot more here. Obviously, there's a lot more we could do, but the main idea here is just to get a piece of data from a API and render it to the screen using just plain JavaScript. And that's what we've done in this lesson. And basically, we just need to create a lot of elements and use the native methods in JavaScript in order to kind of create the elements and then structure them correctly so that we get the markup that we want. And then we can also see that we're able to use fetch to get a data set and then create markup based on that data. So that's pretty cool. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson. And this is it for now, and I'll see you next time.